The house sits quiet most of the time. Few people have caught more than a passing glimpse of its resident. Few on the street know her name. No one knows her story. They don't know her world is midnight black, grope in the dark and hope for help black. They don't know she's been suffering for years, 12 long and painful years. They don't know she's seen many doctors about her condition, too many at this point to count. And they don't know she's paid thousands of dollars to specialists and thousands more on medications to alleviate the pain. Sure, there have been promising signs along the way. A doctor who was certain he had the cure, a new treatment on the market that gave her hope she could return to a normal life. By this point, she's tried them all. But in the end, it's been to no avail. It's not just the physical symptoms that cause her distress. It's also the sense she gets when she sees her neighbors that she is different from them. And she knows she will never have the lives they enjoy, a life free from constant visits to the doctors, a life that seems so unrestricted and at ease. She wonders if anyone could ever really understand what she's going through. What would Jesus say to a person like this if he were to pay a visit to your neighborhood? In his day, there were all kinds of people who suffered from all kinds of illnesses. And to make matters worse, those with such conditions were often shunned by society. But Jesus took a different approach. He went into the towns and countryside and sought out those who had been affected by all forms of ailments, and he healed them. Jesus was willing to reach out to anyone in his neighborhood who came to him in need. And as we will see, he is still willing to reach out in compassion to those who are suffering today. You have to wonder how long it took Matthew to realize that being a disciple of Jesus was going to be different than anything he had expected. It's only a few short verses after we read of Matthew accepting Jesus' invitation to follow him that we find the former tax collector present with Christ as he heals two blind men and raises a girl from the dead. The crowds who witness these events are stunned, and they can only say, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." I have to think that Matthew felt the same way. In a later scene, Matthew describes how Jesus went up on a mountainside one day, and the crowds came to him, bringing along their friends and loved ones who were suffering from all forms of physical ailments. Jesus is with them for 3 days, hearing their stories, sharing firsthand in the pain they are experiencing. But he does more than just lend a compassionate ear. As Matthew writes, great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. Many times I wish that Matthew and his fellow gospel writers had been a bit more descriptive. This is one of those times. And he healed them is too short a phrase to describe what must have been an astonishing sight. Let your imagination go for a moment. Picture the blind husband seeing his wife for the first time. His eyes gaze into her tear-filled ones like she was the queen of the morning. Or envision the man who had never walked, now walking. You can bet he didn't want to sit down. He's running and jumping and doing a dance with the kids. Then there's the deaf woman who can now hear. For the first time, she hears her child call her mama. And what about the mute who can now speak? Oh boy, he's over there at the fire, chatting it up with anyone who will listen. He's singing and saying anything and everything that he had ever wanted to express. For 3 days, it goes on like this. Person after person, mat after mat, crutch after crutch, smile after smile. If we ever had cause to wonder if Jesus really understands our human suffering, this event provides the answer. For 3 days, Jesus is there in the midst of every type of suffering imaginable. We have no record of preaching or teaching or instructing or challenging during this time. He's just there with them, sharing in their pain and healing them. You can only wonder at what Matthew and the other disciples must have felt when they saw Jesus time and again go out of his way to engage with the poor, the needy, the sick. In their Jewish culture, sickness was generally viewed as a form of divine justice for a person's sin. We know this because one time when Jesus and the disciples walked by a man who had been born blind, they asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" Some rabbis of the time apparently taught that an infant could sin while still in the mother's womb, and that such sin could account for inherited defects. On the other hand, the disciples knew from their Torah studies that children are punished for the sin of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. So they're not sure which position is the correct one, so they asked Jesus, their rabbi, for a clarification. The surprising answer from Jesus is none of the above. To get at the root cause, you have to trace this condition back to heaven. The reason the man was born sightless was so the works of God might be displayed in him. Talk about a thankless role. Some sing to God's glory, others teach to God's glory. Who wants to be blind for God's glory? Which is tougher to accept, the condition or discovering it was God's idea? Well, the cure proves to be as surprising as the cause. Jesus spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes. Jesus places a fingerful of this spit putty on the man's eyes and tells him to wash it off in the nearby pool. The result is the first chapter of Genesis just for him. Light where there was darkness. John describes what happens next. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. Come on, John. Where's the description? How about he raced back seeing? He danced back seeing. He roared, whooping and hollering and kissing everything he could for the first time back seeing. The guy had to be thrilled. And we would love to leave him that way. But if this man's life were a cafeteria line, he would have just stepped from the sirloin to the broiled Brussels sprouts. Look at the reaction of the neighbors. Is not this the one who used to sit and beg? Others were saying, this is he. Still others were saying, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the one. These folks don't celebrate, they debate. They've watched this man grope and trip since he was a kid. You'd think they would rejoice, but they don't. No recognition, no celebration. Why? Because apparently Jesus failed to consult the healing handbook. John writes, now it was a Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. The Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. It all makes you wonder who was really blind that day. The neighbors didn't see the man. They saw a novelty. The church leaders didn't see the man. They saw a technicality. The man's parents didn't even see their son. They only saw a social difficulty. In the end, no one saw him, so they put him out. The fella had to be bewildered. Born blind only to be healed, healed only to be kicked out only to be left alone. It seems the man has been dealt more than his share of bad hands. Perhaps you can relate. Maybe you have encountered a similar string of negative turns one after another. You wonder if God sees your ongoing struggles, if he cares. If so, take heart from what happens next. Jesus heard they had thrown him out and went and found him. Jesus isn't content to heal the man and leave it there. He tracks down the troubled pauper. And when the man sees him, his spiritual eyes are opened as well. He believes in Jesus and worships him. Jesus' healing is completed, both physically and spiritually. As we look at these stories of healing in the Gospels, it's clear that Jesus understands our suffering and that he will use our pain for a purpose. Our problems, struggles, heartaches, and hassles cooperate toward one end, and that is the glory of God. Trust me in your times of trouble, God said, and I will rescue you, and you will give me glory. But there is another theme that stands out when we read of Jesus healing the sick in the Gospels, which brings us back to the woman we discussed at the beginning of the session. As you recall, she had been suffering from a chronic condition. Mark pinpoints the cause in his Gospel when he writes, she had been bleeding for 12 years, a chronic menstrual disorder, a perpetual issue of blood. Now, such a condition would be difficult for any woman of any era. But for a member of the Jewish race, nothing could be worse. Anything she touched was considered unclean. No washing dishes, no sweeping floors. She was physically exhausted and socially ostracized. No part of her life was left unaffected. She had suffered very much from many doctors and had spent all the money she had, but instead of improving, she was getting worse. She is a bruised reed. She awakes daily in a body that no one would want. She's down to her last prayer, and on the day we encounter her, she's about to pray it. For she has learned that Jesus is in her town. And by the time she gets to Jesus, he is surrounded by people. He's on the way to help the daughter of Jairus, the most important man in the community. What are the odds he will interrupt an urgent mission with a high official to help the likes of her? Very few. But what are the odds she will survive if she doesn't take a chance? Fewer still. So she takes a chance. If I can just touch his clothes, she thinks, I will be healed. It's a risky decision. To touch him, she will have to touch the people. If one of them recognizes her, it's hello, rebuke, goodbye, cure. But what choice does she have? She has no money, no clout, no friends, no solutions. All she has is a crazy hunch that Jesus can help and a high hope that he will. So she reaches out and she touches his garment. And immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. What's important is not the form of the effort, but the fact of the effort. The fact is she did something. She refused to settle for sickness another day, and she resolved to make a move. This is the theme we find in many of the stories of healing found in the Gospels. Healing begins when we do something. Healing begins when we reach out. Healing starts when we take a step. It's interesting that only one person that day was commended for having faith. It wasn't a wealthy giver. It wasn't a loyal follower. It wasn't an acclaimed teacher. It was a shame-struck and penniless outcast who clutched onto a hunch that Jesus could and would help her. Which, by the way, isn't a bad definition of faith. A conviction that he can help and a hope that he will. Sounds similar to the definition of faith given by the author of the book of Hebrews. Without faith, no one can please God. Anyone who comes to God must believe that he is real and that he rewards those who truly want to find him. God's help is near and always available, but it is only given to those who seek it. Nothing results from apathy. The great work in this story is the mighty healing that occurred, but the great truth is that the healing began with the woman's touch. Her part in the healing itself was very small. All she did was extend her arm through the crowd, but that was all that was needed. And with that small, courageous gesture, she experienced Jesus' healing, tender power. When the prophet Isaiah foretold of Jesus, he described him as one who would take both our sin and our sickness. Surely he took up our pain, Isaiah wrote, and bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. When Matthew later saw the large number of healings in Galilee, he wrote, Jesus fulfilled Isaiah's well-known sermon. He took our illnesses. He carried our diseases. Jesus treated our sickness in the same way he treated our sin. He took it away. Now, this is still a fallen world, and sickness and sin still stalk our planet. But neither sin nor sickness will have dominion over God's people. Sin cannot condemn us. Disease cannot destroy us. In fact, the very sin and sickness that Satan intends for evil, God redeems for good. Sin becomes a showcase of His grace, and sickness becomes a demonstration of God's ability to heal. You need not live beneath the specter of uncontrollable plagues or emotions. Every fiber, molecule, and brainwave answers to His command. He is in charge. So, if you are sick, cry out to Jesus. He will heal you. He may do this instantly. One word was enough for Him to banish demons, heal epilepsy, and raise the dead. He may do this for you, or He may heal you gradually. In the case of the blind man we looked at earlier, Jesus healed him in stages. Your highest certainty, however, is that He will heal you ultimately. In heaven, God will restore your body to its intended splendor. As John wrote, when He is revealed, we shall be like Him. And God will turn your tomb into a womb, out of which you will be born with a perfect body. In the meantime, know that He understands what you are facing, and keep seeking Him in prayer.